She ran away into the freezing night, believing home was the last place she belonged. Hungry, exhausted, she stepped into a diner, never knowing danger was already waiting. A gang of bikers circled her like vultures, mocking her, daring her to break. No one spoke up, no one moved. Just when she thought no one would come, he walked in, the father she hated, the soldier she feared, the only man who ever stood between her and the world. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter pressed against the small wooden house on Spokane's outskirts, snow piling on the roof until the world outside the windows felt distant, muffled, and strangely irrelevant. Inside, the house felt bigger than it really was, not because of space, but because of everything unsaid stretching between the walls. James Walker stood in the kitchen, one hand on the edge of the counter, staring at a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The clock on the wall ticked in small, stubborn beats, as if time itself refused to stop for anyone's grief. Retirement was supposed to give him peace. Instead, it gave him long, exposed hours where no mission briefings arrived, no orders were barked, and no one told him who needed him most. All he had was this house, the silence, and a daughter who looked at him as if he were a stranger who had borrowed her father's face. Ghost lay in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, paws tucked under, watching James without blinking. The dog understood. Tension, the way he understood weather fronts and danger zones. He could feel the air tighten, even when no one was speaking. His loyalty gravitated toward both humans in this house, but he also understood something fundamental. Loyalty could not fix distance, only wait it out. Upstairs, footsteps traced a restless pattern across Emily's room. Drawers opened and closed, something soft thumped to the floor, then was scooped back up. To anyone else, it would sound like a teenager being dramatic on a winter afternoon. To James, it sounded like packing. It sounded like leaving. He remembered other sounds from this same house. A smaller pair of feet chasing after Ghost. Laughter rolling down the stairs. A woman's voice calling both their names with an easy warmth he never learned how to imitate. Back then, he only came home between deployments. He told himself each short stay mattered more because it was brief. Now, in the hollow that followed his wife's death, those justifications rang thin and brittle. The framed photo on the living room shelf caught his eye. A frozen moment of his wife's smile, Emily leaning into her side, his own arm around them both. It felt like a report from another lifetime, filed away and misdelivered to the wrong man. The heater clicked on and off in bursts, never quite catching up to the chill that seeped through the windows. Winter outside, winter inside. James rubbed his thumb along the rim of the mug. He wanted to go upstairs, knock on the door, and say something that would pull them both back from whatever edge they were teetering on. But every sentence he rehearsed sounded wrong. I did my best. I had no choice. The mission. That word still sat at the center of every decision he'd ever made, a compass that led him through firefights, dark seas, and foreign towns where everyone wore suspicion on their faces. But a mission had stolen him away the night the car went off the road and his wife didn't come home. Emily never said that out loud, but he heard it anyway, in every narrowed look and clipped answer. The stairs creaked. James looked up as Emily appeared in the doorway, jacket already on, backpack strap over one shoulder. She didn't look messy or reckless. She looked decided. The snowlight behind her framed her like the outline of someone about to step out of a photograph. Ghost lifted his head, ears pricking, his gaze darting between them, reading the tilt of her shoulders, the set of James's jaw. "Don't start," Emily said, before he'd even drawn a breath. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness felt like a dam built too quickly over a breaking river. "Don't ask me to come sit. Don't ask what's wrong. You know what's wrong." James swallowed words that rose too late. He wished, fiercely, suddenly, that he'd practiced different lines over the years. Not explanations, just simple things. I missed you. I was scared too. It wasn't just you who lost her. Emily, he said, and her name came out softer than he intended, almost fragile. She flinched at the sound, not because it hurt, but because it almost didn't fit him. It was easier to resent a stone wall than a man whose voice cracked a little. Mom needed you, she said. No anger at first, just a raw statement of fact, an autopsy report for his failures. You were halfway around the world, again. There were so many things he could have said in defense. The operation had been critical. People depended on him he hadn't known. But all of that sounded like he was putting a price tag on his absence. And there was no version of the story where his reasons outweighed a 15-year-old girl sitting in a hospital corridor alone, waiting for news that never had a happy ending. You're right, James said. The admission tasted like metal. Emily's eyes widened for a moment, as if she'd swung at him expecting a wall and hit empty air instead. But surprise didn't melt her anger. It only sharpened the edge. You can't just say that and think it fixes anything, she snapped. You missed the worst night of my life, and then you came home and acted like we could just move on, like grief was another deployment. He looked at her and saw all the things he'd missed. The year her shoulders sank a little, the night she stopped leaving the bedroom door open, the mornings she walked past him with earbuds in and eyes fixed straight ahead. He had been there physically, but his mind was still wired for threats far away, not the quiet destruction happening at his own table. Ghost rose to his feet, moving closer to Emily with careful steps. He nudged her leg once, a silent plea not to go too far in words she'd regret. She didn't push him away, but her hand only brushed his head in a distracted arc before falling back to her side. I can't stay here tonight, she said. No trembling, no theatrics, just a verdict. James felt something inside him clench. The house had already lost one heartbeat. The idea of losing another, even temporarily, made the air feel thinner. It's late, he said quietly. The roads are bad. What he meant was, I'm scared. I can cover you from gunfire, I can drag you out of a blast zone, but I don't know how to keep you safe from the things that haunt you when you walk out that door angry at me. I'll manage, Emily replied. She glanced at the photo on the shelf and then away quickly, as if it burned her eyes. I've managed a lot on my own already. The words landed heavier than any insult. They weren't thrown to hurt him. They were simply the truth as she'd lived it. And truth was always heavier than anger. Ghost whined softly, shifting his weight, torn between following her and obeying instincts that told him not to leave James alone with that look on his face. Snow pressed against the windows, blurring the world beyond. This house had once been a shelter from storms. Now it was the eye of one. Emily grasped the doorknob. For a second, her shoulders shook, almost invisible, more like a shiver than a hesitation. If he reached out now, if he said the right thing, maybe she would stay, or maybe she would feel trapped and explode worse. He had no tactical training for this kind of standoff. There were no rules of engagement when the battlefield was a kitchen, and the casualty was trust. He tried again, softer. She didn't turn fully, only tilted her head a fraction, enough to show she was listening, but unwilling to give him the dignity of eye contact. I know I can't fix what I did, James said, the words dragging themselves into the open. I can't fix that I wasn't there, but I'm here now. That's all I've got. It was not enough. He knew it even as he said it. But it was honest, stripped of excuses. Emily let out a short, broken breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sob, and neither. You're here, she said, but you're not with me. There's a difference. She opened the door. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of snow and asphalt and distant traffic. Ghost took a small step forward, muscles tense. She stepped out onto the porch, backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulder. For a heartbeat, James could have reached out and caught her wrist. He didn't. Not because he wanted her to go, but because he knew grabbing her would only confirm every fear she had about him controlling her life the way the Navy had once controlled his. "I'll be back," she said without looking. "Or I won't. I just need to breathe somewhere that doesn't feel like a grave." The words slammed the door harder than her hand did. She left it half open, and then she was gone, boots leaving sharp marks in the snow. Ghost stepped into the doorway, staring after her, his whole body listening. James stood frozen, every instinct screaming to act, to chase, to stop. This from becoming another moment he'd replay for the rest of his life. But he'd learned the hard way that charging without a plan got people killed. He closed his eyes for a count of 3, then exhaled. "Not this time," he whispered to himself. Ghost turned his head, as if checking whether that vow was real. James grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, shrugged it on, and took the keys from the hook. He knelt briefly beside Ghost, resting a hand on the dog's neck. "We're going after her," he said. Ghost's body relaxed in a way that wasn't quite relief, but something close, purpose. The dog trotted ahead of him toward the truck, as if they were heading into a familiar operation. Outside, the cold hit James like a reprimand. Snowflakes settled on his hair and shoulders, melting slowly into the fabric. He locked the door behind them. For the first time since his wife's death, stepping away from the house didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like pursuit of his daughter, of redemption, of a chance to be the man she needed instead of the soldier everyone else had needed. Ghost jumped into the passenger seat without needing an invitation. James slid behind the wheel, gripping it tighter than necessary. For a moment he stared at his own reflection in the dark glass of the windshield. Older, tired, still standing. He started the engine. The truck rumbled to life, headlights etching twin paths of pale gold into the thickening snow. "Hang on, kid," he murmured, as if Emily could hear him across the drifting streets. Ghost stared ahead, alert, already searching for what had been lost. The truck rolled forward into Spokane's winter night, following tire tracks that were already beginning to fade. Snow pressed against Emily's cheeks as she walked, the cold needling through her thin gloves, while streetlights smeared pale halos across the wet pavement. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant glow of the main road, the one that led away from their quiet neighborhood and into Spokane's more crowded, less personal streets. Each breath stung her lungs, and the weight of her backpack dug into one shoulder, but turning back felt impossible, like admitting that leaving had only been a noisy loop that ended where it started. She told herself she had done this on principle, that she was making a point, proving she was not a child who would just absorb every wound and sit still at the same kitchen table. Underneath that polished pride, however, something softer flickered, something that sounded uncomfortably like doubt. The cold helped drown it out. After 20 minutes of walking, her anger was still hot, but her body was starting to lose the argument. Her fingers ached, her toes felt like someone had replaced them with stones, and a new problem pushed its way to the front of her mind. Hunger. She had stormed out before dinner, too furious to stay, too proud to grab anything on the way out. Now her stomach complained with sharp, sour twists, and she realized that righteous exits rarely considered logistics. She stopped under a flickering street lamp and pulled her phone from her pocket. The screen lit her face with a harsh glow. There were no missed calls or messages from her father. For a second, bitterness surged. Of course he had not called. Maybe he thought staying out all night would teach her something about respect. Maybe he was letting her cool off. Or maybe, a quieter voice suggested, he was sitting at that same counter, staring at the door, trying to gather words he did not know how to use. She shut the thought down before it could grow roots. The battery indicator was low. She opened her banking app and checked her balance. The number that appeared made her chest tighten. It was not nothing, but it was far from enough to buy more than a cheap meal and maybe a bus ride if she needed it. No safety net, no secret savings. Just a handful of dollars and stubbornness. She put the phone away and rubbed her hands together, scanning the block ahead. A few shops were already dark, windows reflecting the snowy sidewalks like blank mirrors. Farther down, a neon sign buzzed weakly above a low building, throwing a dull red and white glow against the slush. A diner. The kind of place that always seemed to exist at the edge of any American town, open late enough for truckers, insomniacs, and people who did not want to go home yet. She hesitated, then moved toward it. Once inside, warmth washed over her, thick with the smell of frying oil and coffee that had probably been reheated more than once. The sudden change from cold to heat made her eyes sting. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A handful of customers sat scattered at booths and along the counter, bent over plates, phones, or nothing at all. The place did not feel friendly or unfriendly. It just existed, like a waiting room for people in transit. Emily stood near the entrance for a moment, taking it in. A waitress in a faded name tag that read Carla glanced over with tired curiosity, then offered a small nod toward the open seats. Emily nodded back, more out of reflex than gratitude, and chose a booth near one of the windows. From there, she could see the street, the falling snow, and the vague edge of her own reflection staring back at her. She slid into the seat and pulled her backpack into the booth beside her, creating a small barrier between herself and the world. When Carla approached with a laminated menu, Emily forced herself to sound casual. "Can I just get a minute?" Carla gave her a quick look, the kind that measured whether a customer would pay or linger, and said, "Sure thing," before heading back toward the counter. Left alone, Emily opened the menu and skimmed the prices with a sinking feeling. Everything cost more than she wanted it to. The cheapest options were still significant bites out of her balance. She did the math in her head, subtracting, rearranging, trying to decide what future she might be buying with each line item. A bus ticket home, if she chose that. A ride to somewhere else if she convinced herself she had a friend's couch ready. Her pride insisted she would not go back tonight, but her body argued that she also could not wander the streets all night with nothing in her stomach. In the end, she settled on something simple and filling. No drink besides water, no dessert, no extras. Just enough to silence the gnawing in her gut. Carla reappeared, pencil poised over her pad. "You ready, hon?" The casual term of endearment scraped against Emily's raw mood, but she let it pass. "Yeah, I'll have the special," she said, pointing to the cheapest combo on the menu. "And water." She hesitated, then added, "Tap is fine." Carla wrote it down and nodded, lingering a heartbeat longer than needed. "You out late by yourself in this weather?" Emily tensed. "I'm fine." Carla raised one eyebrow, the kind of look that said she had heard that line more times than she could count, usually from people who were not. Still, she did not push. "Food will be out soon," she said, and walked away. Emily exhaled slowly, trying to unwind the tight coil in her chest. If anyone else asked, she might snap. She needed to stay invisible, eat, and figure out the next step. That plan lasted all of 30 seconds. The door opened behind her with a jingle of the bell, letting in a gust of cold air and a surge of noise that did not match the subdued energy of the diner. Male voices rolled in first, loud and careless, followed by the dull thud of heavy boots on the tile. Emily did not turn around right away. She stared at her own reflection in the dark glass and watched her shoulders rise a fraction. She did not need to look to know the type. She had seen men like this in news clips and parking lots, groups who moved as if the space belonged to them by default. Laughter sharper than the jokes, volume just high enough to force everyone else to listen. The booth seats creaked as several bodies dropped into them at once, somewhere near the back. The noise level in the diner crept up. Someone snorted. Someone slapped a table. Carla's voice floated through the room, trying to stay friendly while clearly bracing herself. Emily's jaw clenched. She heard one of the men say something crude about the coffee, followed by another voice mocking the decor. Then a third telling some story that involved a bar fight and a dented motorcycle. The words were not what bothered her so much as the tone, the way they filled every empty space with themselves. She wished she could turn off her ears. Her food arrived faster than she expected, a plate set down with practiced efficiency. Carla placed the glass of water beside it and leaned down just a little. "You let me know if you need anything else," she said softly, eyes flicking toward the back of the diner for a fraction of a second. It was the kind of warning that did not want to be called a warning. Emily nodded and picked up her fork. The first bite felt like swallowing hot relief. The second loosened a knot she had not known was in her shoulders. As she ate, she tried to focus only on the plate, the warmth, the simple fact that she had managed something on her own. Her life might be complicated, but this one act was straightforward. She had left. She had found shelter. She was feeding herself. No one could claim credit for that. Then one of the voices from the back cut through clearer than the rest. "Hey, check out the runaway." The words were not that loud, but the diner had fallen into that particular quiet in which any sentence about someone becomes a spotlight. Emily's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She stared at the plate, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her turn. Another voice joined in, rougher. "Yeah, look at her. Backpack, no one with her, out in this bleed of a night. Bet she told Daddy off and slammed a door. Cute." A few snickers followed. Heat flooded Emily's face, hot enough to embarrass her, hot enough to make her furious. They did not know her. They did not know James, or the empty chair at their table, or the years of forced resilience she had built like armor. To them, she was a type, a script they could fill in, a punchline. Her hand tightened around the fork. Part of her told her to ignore them, to keep eating, to let their words run off like melted snow. She had done that often enough in school hallways, in grocery store aisles where strangers assumed things about her or her father or why he stood so stiffly in line. Another part of her, the part that had spoken up in classrooms when teachers were unfair and had walked out tonight, rather than sit under a gaze that felt like pressure, flared in protest. Carla's steps quickened as she moved past Emily's booth toward the bikers. Emily heard her say, "You boys need to order something or keep it down. People are trying to eat." Respectable, measured, braver than most would be in her position. One of the men responded with a teasing comeback, the kind that disguised disrespect as humor. Chairs scraped. A hand slapped a table again. Emily's heart drummed harder. She hated that her pulse sped up just because a group of loud men had noticed her. She hated how familiar the feeling of being evaluated was. Ever since her mother's funeral, she had sensed it everywhere. Pitying adults, curious classmates, neighbors who looked at her father's rigid posture and whispered theories. Everyone had a story about them. No one had asked for the truth. She swallowed another bite, more forcefully than necessary, and set her fork down. Her body felt split between urges. One half wanted to vanish, to slip out quietly, to disappear into the night with what remained of her pride and her checking account. The other half wanted to turn in her seat, meet their eyes, and let them know she was not a toy for their boredom. If she backed down now, it felt like admitting that the world could keep writing her story without her input. If she confronted them, she might trigger something she could not control. Somewhere in her memory, a hallway scene flashed. She was 13. Some older boy had made a joke about her mother being gone, and she had punched him before she even knew she was moving. She remembered the crack of knuckles, the sting, the way the principal had lectured her father about violence. Later that night, James had sat across from her in his uniform, looking at his own hands, silent. He had not praised her. He had not scolded her either. He had simply said, "You do not throw the first punch unless you are ready for what comes after," she forced herself to breathe more slowly. First punch. Consequences. She was alone here. No one to back her up, no one to call except the man she had just accused of not being there. The irony threatened to choke her. One of the bikers whistled, a short, sharp sound. "Hey, sweetheart," he called. "You running away from something? Or to something?" The words rolled toward her booth like an invitation and a test wrapped together. Her jaw tightened. She turned her head just enough to see them from the corner of her eye. There were several men at the back tables, leather vests, tattoos, the usual markings of people who liked being noticed. Their expressions hovered somewhere between amusement and challenge. Emily met the gaze of the one who had spoken, just for a second. Then she looked back at her plate. "I'm trying to eat," she said, loud enough to carry, but not loud enough to sound like a shout. "You should try it sometime instead of running your mouth." The words left her before she could reconsider them. The diner went still. A fork clinked against ceramic in the next booth. She heard someone exhale as if they had been holding their breath. For half a heartbeat, there was silence. And in that silence, she felt something fierce and small inside her stand a little taller. Then chairs scraped again, heavier now. Someone pushed away from the table at the back. She did not have to look to know that one of them was standing. She stared at the reflection in the window instead, watching the shapes behind her blur and sharpen with each step they took toward her booth. On the glass, above her own faint outline, the entrance door loomed in the corner of her vision. The bell above it hung still. The man's footsteps grew louder, the room shrinking with each sound. Emily's fingers closed around her fork again. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. She told herself she would not show fear, not after everything she had already weathered. As the biker's shadow stretched across her table, the front door suddenly shook with a rush of cold air, the bell chiming sharply as someone else entered the diner. Warm air rushed into the diner as the door opened, carrying the sharp scent of winter and the faint echo of bootsteps approaching across ice-crusted pavement. Emily kept her gaze locked on the reflection in the window, refusing to turn, refusing to let fear or pride pull her in any direction but forward. The biker's shadow hovered beside her booth, waiting for her to flinch, waiting for her to look up first, waiting for confirmation that his presence meant control. But the sound of the bell over the door unsettled the moment. It didn't silence anything, didn't chase the threat away, but shifted the balance just enough that everyone in the diner paused, recalibrated, reconsidered. She recognized that shift with instinct alone, the same way she used to sense when her father walked into a room before she saw him. That feeling hit her again, familiar and unwelcome, like a bruise she thought had faded suddenly, flaring back to life. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to hope. But her heartbeat betrayed her, thudding harder, as if her own body anticipated something she refused to name. Her fork hovered above her plate. Her hands felt steady, but her breathing grew thin, shallow. She sensed the biker beside her stiffen slightly, as though whoever had entered was someone he needed to identify before acting further. That detail alone pulled a fine wire of tension between them. Emily stared into her reflection one more second, then turned just enough to look at the entrance without fully facing it. A man stood near the doorway, brushing snow from his shoulders as the wind nudged at the door behind him. He didn't fill the space with noise or presence. He just stood still for a beat, scanning the diner with the slow, methodical gaze of someone who evaluated rooms the way others read headlines, quickly, completely, and with practiced caution. When his eyes met hers, Emily froze, pulse hammering at her throat. James Walker didn't smile. He didn't frown. His expression held something steadier, quieter, as if he had prepared himself for what he might find, but still needed a second to believe she was actually sitting there. Ghost stood beside him, not crowding the doorway, not demanding attention, but anchored with the intensity of a presence shaped by loyalty and storms. The dog's gaze flicked toward Emily first, then toward the biker whose shadow still cut across her table. Instinct radiated from Ghost like heat from smoldering coals, awareness sharpened by memory, readiness shaped by 1,000 silent moments walking at James's side over foreign soil. Emily's breath caught. She hated how relief felt too close to panic. She hated that seeing her father didn't immediately make her feel safe. It made everything more complicated, as if childhood warmth, love, abandonment, duty, guilt, and longing had collided inside her at once. James didn't rush to her booth. He didn't move at all for a long second. Emily saw the calculations flicker behind his eyes, not about whether she was safe, he had already measured that in the space of a breath, but about how close danger sat and what his next word or silence might provoke. Carla emerged from behind the counter, eyebrows rising just a fraction. She didn't seem surprised to see someone walk in, but she reacted to James the way people react to weather changing. Not frightened, but alert, braced for something that might matter. The biker standing near Emily's shoulder shifted his weight, half turning to look at James with the kind of expression men wore when sizing up someone who might interrupt their entertainment. Emily felt humiliation burn across her skin. She didn't want to be rescued, didn't want to be seen as someone her father had to retrieve like a dropped glove. But somewhere beneath her fury, a tremor of something older stirred, a part of her that once believed he could handle anything, protect anyone, fix everything. That belief had died years ago, yet its ghost lingered stubbornly in her chest. The diner remained quiet enough that Emily could hear her own heartbeat. James stepped forward, Ghost matching him without hesitation. There was no aggression in either of them, just a presence that demanded attention in spite of its restraint. James didn't look at the biker first. He looked at Emily, not with disappointment, not with anger, with something harder to bear, recognition. As if he finally saw her not as a child who slammed doors, but as someone who walked into the world alone and faced the consequences on her own terms. Shame flared briefly in her chest. Not shame for speaking back to the bikers, not shame for leaving home, but shame for how easily she assumed he would chase her only to judge her. Instead, he stood there, not asking why she left, not demanding she return, but acknowledging with his eyes that she had chosen her path and he had chosen to follow, not to drag her back, but to walk within. Reach. She opened her mouth, unsure whether anger or apology would come out, but before she could speak, the biker beside her cleared his throat, a low sound like a warning or a challenge. James finally turned his gaze toward the man. The room chilled a degree. Emily could almost feel the shift in air pressure, like a storm forming somewhere not yet visible. James didn't speak, didn't posture, didn't square his shoulders the way other men might. He simply regarded the biker with a calm so steady it bordered on unnerving. Ghost's attention sharpened as well, not with aggression, but with readiness. Emily saw something pass between the men, not threat, not submission, but assessment. The biker broke eye contact first. It was subtle, slow, almost masked by the tilt of his head as he looked back toward his companions, but Emily saw it. More importantly, James saw it. The biker stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but reconsidering. He muttered something toward his table, earning a few grunts and a short laugh, but the sound lacked the earlier bravado. Emily felt her pulse slowing, but her stomach twisted with conflict. She didn't want her father to take over. She didn't want him to speak for her. She didn't want him to think she came here expecting rescue. Yet she also couldn't deny the flood of warmth beneath her ribs when his presence redirected the room away from her. Carla approached James cautiously. "Evening," she said, voice low. James nodded once, like someone acknowledging shared awareness rather than exchanging pleasantries. Carla's gaze slid toward Emily, then back to him. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She just said, "Water?" He nodded again. Carla disappeared to fill the glass. Emily stared at him, torn between gratitude and resentment, wanting to shout and whisper and demand and confess all at once. But James didn't move closer. He kept a respectful distance, as if giving her the choice of what happened next. Ghost sat beside him, angled toward her without stepping forward, anchored like a promise she hadn't accepted but couldn't refuse. Emily swallowed hard. She wanted to ask why he came. She wanted to ask how he found her. But when she looked into his eyes, she understood both answers without words. Because he always would, and because there were only so many places a hurting daughter might go when she wanted to be alone, but still unconsciously wished someone would follow. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The silence between them wasn't warm, but it wasn't frozen either. It felt like a thaw, like something inching toward melt without knowing how long it would take. Carla returned with the water, setting it gently on the nearest table. The biker at the back whistled softly again, but the sound held less sharpness than before, like he wasn't sure whether the joke was worth the outcome anymore. Emily's breath slowed. For the first time since leaving home, she didn't feel entirely alone. But she didn't feel safe either, not because of the bikers, but because her father's presence forced her to face a truth she had been trying to outrun. Leaving home didn't take the pain with her, and finding shelter didn't mean she knew how to go back. Ghost's gaze flicked toward her, then toward James, as if measuring the distance between them in something deeper than steps. Emily felt a tremor of exhaustion spread through her limbs, the kind that came when adrenaline drained and emotion surged. She wanted to tell him she wasn't ready to go home. She wanted to tell him she wasn't ready to forgive. But before she could find any words that didn't cut both ways, the bell above the diner door chimed again. Cold air swept in, and someone new entered with a hurried step that made Carla look up sharply and the bikers twist in their seats. Emily's eyes widened, not because she knew the newcomer, but because of what she saw in Carla's reaction. Whatever was about to happen next, it wasn't just about her anymore. Wind slipped through the diner door before it shut, carrying snowflakes that clung briefly to tile and melted into small reflective dots beneath fluorescent light. Emily didn't blink when the newcomer entered, but her attention tightened, like a thread pulled taut. The diner had become a fragile battlefield of glances, half-spoken threats, and silent promises. And one more presence threatened to push everything past the point of balance. She didn't recognize the man who walked in. He looked tired more than anything else, as if his day had worn him down to the bone, but there was something in his eyes that took measure of the room faster than his feet crossed the entrance. He approached the counter with a tense politeness, nodding once at Carla, before asking quietly if they were still serving. His voice barely carried, yet Emily felt a faint ripple move through the group of bikers at the back. She didn't know why at first, but when the man slipped his phone into his pocket, she noticed his hand trembled for half a second, and in that tremor, she saw the outline of something wounded and raw. Carla guided him to a table near the window opposite Emily's booth, and he sat heavily, rubbing his palms together as if coaxing warmth from air that refused to give any. Nothing about him seemed dangerous, yet Ghost watched him intently, not with suspicion, but with a peculiar awareness that hinted at recognition of a certain kind of pain. Emily saw that and felt an involuntary pull in her chest. Ghost rarely fixed on strangers without reason. James remained where he was, not claiming a seat, not demanding attention, simply standing still as though giving Emily the space to choose what happened next. She hated how that small gesture shook her resolve more deeply than any apology could have. Her mind replayed moments she could not outrun, long nights waiting for her father to come home, the sound of keys turning in a door too late to erase the silence that had settled. There, the memory of her mother's voice fading into static when the phone call came. She pressed her lips together, swallowing hard, unsure whether the tightness in her throat came from pride or grief. The biker nearest her, the one who had stood before, shifted again as he noticed her glance toward James. His smirk crept back, though with less confidence than before, and he leaned closer as if testing whether the balance of the room had truly changed. Emily's hand twitched toward her glass, ready to lift it as a shield or a weapon. She wasn't sure which, but she forced herself to stay still. If she moved first, she'd lose ground she didn't have to spare. James's voice broke the silence before the biker could speak. It wasn't loud or sharp, just steady, the kind of tone that carried through noise without rising above it. "I'm not here to make trouble," he said, eyes still on Emily. The sentence was simple, yet it landed with weight because everyone understood. Trouble was already breathing in the room, waiting for a spark. The biker let out a low laugh. "Good," he said, tapping the back of Emily's booth with 2 fingers. "Wouldn't want anyone to get the wrong idea." Emily felt something hot spark under her ribs. Not fear, not fully anger, but a refusal to be reduced to a prop in someone else's game. She shifted her gaze toward the biker and met his eyes without flinching. He didn't like that. His posture stiffened, as though she'd shoved him. The newcomer near the window looked up just then, watching the exchange without inserting himself, yet his expression tightened at the edges, as though the atmosphere pressed against him too. Carla returned from the kitchen with plates balanced carefully in her hands, her movements slightly quicker than before. She set the newcomer's order down, then turned to James with a questioning look that wasn't quite a request and wasn't quite concern. Emily wondered whether Carla sensed more than she let on, whether years of closing shifts had trained her to read danger the way Ghost did, with an instinct honed by repetition. James took the water Carla had placed earlier and lifted it slightly toward her in acknowledgement, then set it back down, his fingers resting loosely around the glass, yet ready for anything. Ghost stood close to him, gaze shifting between Emily, the biker, and the newcomer, as though mapping out invisible paths no one else could see. Emily's stomach twisted again. She wanted to tell James not to hover, not to guard her like she was still 12 and fragile, but she also couldn't deny the thin thread of relief running under her anger. Being alone in the world was something she'd chosen, but that didn't mean she didn't feel the cold of it. The biker leaned closer still, inhaling like he wanted to taste her discomfort. "Still hungry, sweetheart?" he asked. Emily didn't look at him this time. She looked at James instead. The words came out steadier than she expected. "I can handle myself." Silence stretched again, not brittle, but taut. James nodded once, barely perceptible, as if granting permission for her to stand where she stood instead of stepping in front of her. His restraint felt heavier than intervention would have. Emily's pulse slowed enough for her to breathe, but relief was brief. The newcomer near the window rose abruptly, chair scraping loud against tile. His face had gone pale, eyes darting toward the door, then toward his phone, then toward the bikers, as though something urgent pressed against him from the outside world. Carla moved toward him quickly. "You all right?" she asked, keeping her voice low. He hesitated before answering, words catching in his throat. Give me a minute. Got some bad news." His voice cracked on the last word. Carla nodded and stepped back without prying. The bikers exchanged looks, sensing vulnerability like wolves scenting blood, and Emily felt her fists clench. Something in the newcomer's tone, the way he struggled to stay composed, struck her deeper than she expected. It was the way grief tried to stay quiet before it spilled. James noticed it too. His gaze flicked toward the newcomer, and a shadow passed through his expression. Not curiosity, not pity, but recognition. Emily hated how much she recognized it too. She stared at her half-finished plate, wishing hunger and sadness didn't look so similar when swallowed. The newcomer sat again, elbows on the table, hands covering his mouth. The diner felt smaller, heavier, as if pain collected in corners waiting to be acknowledged. Emily exhaled, unsure whether she was bracing for her own memories or for something about to happen around her. Carla turned toward the kitchen, but before she took a single step, the biker behind Emily spoke again, louder this time, directing his voice at the newcomer. "Hey, pal, what's got you spooked? Someone die?" The words hit the diner like a slap. Carla froze. The newcomer flinched. Ghost's head snapped toward the biker. Emily's heartbeat surged. She looked at James and saw his fingers tighten around the edge of the table, not to strike, not yet, but to anchor himself. For the first time since entering, James's eyes left Emily fully and settled on the biker with a cold, steady calm. Emily didn't breathe, afraid any movement might break the balance holding everything together by a thread. Then the diner door opened again, the bell chiming once more, and the wind that rushed in carried something sharper than snow, voices from outside, raised and urgent, approaching fast. The voices outside rose sharply before the door swung shut again, muffling them into a tense hum that clung to every breath inside the diner. Emily felt the air tighten, as if the walls themselves expected something to snap. The newcomer sat hunched over his table, one hand gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles paled. His chest rose and fell in uneven pulls, as if he couldn't control how much air grief allowed him to take in. The bikers watched him with a predatory curiosity that made Emily's stomach knot, and she hated how familiar it felt to witness someone's private hurt being turned into entertainment. Carla moved toward the newcomer, whispering something Emily couldn't hear, but the tremor in Carla's shoulders said enough. The newcomer shook his head once, blinked rapidly, and sat upright as if forcing himself back into his own body. James hadn't moved from where he stood, but the air around him felt wired with intent. Emily noticed how he seemed to expand, without shifting an inch, as if silently promising the room that nothing would harm her while he breathed. His restraint wrapped around her like a shield she didn't ask for yet couldn't refuse. Ghost stood beside him, motionless, but far from relaxed. Emily sensed that the dog recognized the emotional battlefield before the humans did. Ghost's stillness radiated with the quiet readiness of someone who knew that pain was often a warning sign before impact. Emily's hunger returned in a dull wave, but she didn't touch her food again. She felt like a held breath, waiting, bracing, unsure what would force her to exhale. The biker closest to her leaned back slightly, examining James as if testing how deep calm could run before it cracked. His attention shifted to the newcomer, and Emily recognized the dangerous glint of someone who believed another person's vulnerability was an invitation. "Rough night?" the biker said, voice pitched louder than necessary. The newcomer didn't respond, but his shoulders tightened like someone trying to hold their skeleton together. The biker's smile grew thinner. "Come on, man, no need to cry in your eggs. The world's rough for all of us." Emily felt heat crawl up her neck, not pity but anger on behalf of someone whose pain was being toyed with like string between careless fingers. Before she could speak, the newcomer's voice cracked through the diner, low but trembling. "My brother just died," he said. "Got the call on the way here." Silence struck like recoil. Even the humming light seemed to shrink. Emily's breath caught, not because she knew him, but because she knew the weight of hearing death through a phone call, of being too far away to change the outcome, of having the world move on without waiting for your grief to catch up. Her chest tightened painfully. She couldn't look at James, afraid she'd see her own reflection in his eyes, fear, guilt, anger, longing, all tangled. The biker's posture faltered for a split second, as though he hadn't expected his target to bleed real sorrow. That brief hesitation lit something hot in Emily. She finally turned and looked him dead in the eyes. "Is that funny to you?" she asked. Her voice didn't crack. It rang with the steadiness she wished she'd had when her mother died, steadiness she'd only learned after losing too much. The biker blinked, absorbing her challenge, but something in his gaze hardened again, like a man refusing to be outmaneuvered by someone he had tried to belittle. Other bikers shifted, restless. The balance was slipping. Ghost's gaze flicked toward Emily, then toward the biker, as if charting a line only he could see. The newcomer wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to hide the gesture, but failing. Grief made people clumsy, Emily thought, not with their bodies, but with their defenses. She remembered how her father came home after the funeral, how he sat at the dining room table, hands motionless, eyes open but empty, as if he was learning how to breathe without orders. She remembered wanting to scream at him, to shake him, to demand why he hadn't been there. But underneath that fury was a wound that cut more deeply. She hadn't known how to speak through her own pain, and neither had he. The biker closest to James let out a humorless laugh, a thin scrape of sound. "People die," he said with a shrug. "That's life." Emily felt her body tense, but before she could respond, the newcomer stood abruptly, chair scraping again. "It wasn't supposed to be today," he said, voice barely holding. "He was coming to visit me for Christmas. He was supposed to walk through a door, not—" His words fractured. He shut his eyes, trying to trap the pain behind his eyelids. Emily felt a flash of memory, her mother's coat hanging by the door, still smelling like winter and perfume days after the funeral. The coat waiting for arms that would never return. Her throat tightened. The biker smirked again, uncomfortable with emotion he didn't know how to face. World doesn't care about what's supposed to be. James stepped forward then, not fast, not threatening, but with intention that made every biker shift unconsciously. His voice was calm, controlled, a tone Emily knew meant he had finally chosen his place in the moment. "Some things deserve respect," he said. The biker's expression flickered. That quiet sentence struck deeper than any shout. Emily felt her heart pound, not in fear but in recognition. She knew that tone. He had used it the day of the funeral when he spoke to the priest with more grief than he allowed himself to show her. The biker scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. Respect's earned. Emily stood before she could stop herself. "Losing someone earns it," she said, her voice steady, even when her hands were not. Her gaze locked with the biker's, and for the first time, his eyes wavered, not because she frightened him, but because her pain wasn't a performance he could mock without consequence. The newcomer looked at Emily then, a silent exchange of understanding passing between two people who had lost something they could never get back. She didn't nod, didn't offer sympathy aloud, but he seemed to recognize what her steady posture meant. She wouldn't let anyone turn his grief into cruelty again. Ghost stepped closer to James, energy coiled, prepared for whatever came next. Emily felt a strange warmth in her chest, anger, grief, loyalty, and something like pride tangled together. She didn't want her father to speak for her, but she didn't mind him being there when she spoke for herself. The biker opened his mouth again, ready to reclaim dominance he felt slipping. Then the bell over the door rang once more, and the cold wind that followed carried a voice Emily recognized instantly, a voice that hadn't called her name in years, but once whispered it against her hair when she was small. Her breath caught mid-air. The room blurred for a heartbeat. She turned toward the entrance, pulse racing in disbelief as she saw the last person she expected step inside. The door remained half open as snow swirled around the threshold, letting the winter air paint a thin layer of frost across the floor tiles before the gust faded. Emily stood utterly still, breath frozen mid-chest, as the voice that had wrapped itself around her earliest memories now echoed again, brittle with years and distance. A woman stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat with slow, careful motions, as if acclimating herself not just to the diner's warmth, but to the weight of the space she had entered. Her movements were cautious, purposeful, as though she had practiced this reappearance many times before choosing to act. Emily's heart stuttered painfully. She felt as if her ribs suddenly shrank inward, compressing her lungs until she could barely take in air. The woman closed the door fully, sealing out the wind with a soft thud that felt louder than any argument Emily had ever had with her father. The room did not greet her. Instead, it held its breath, as if recognizing a shift without understanding its direction. Carla blinked, startled, but recovered quickly, offering a polite greeting as she would to any customer. The woman responded with a nod before her gaze drifted across the room, landing at last on Emily. The impact of that silent stare struck deeper than any shouted reunion could have. Emily opened her mouth, but no sound formed. Her throat tightened, not with anger, not with grief, but with disbelief. A disbelief rooted in the years she spent imagining this moment in 1,000 different shapes, none resembling the reality in front of her. Ghost shifted beside James, awareness rising through him like a tide. Emily sensed the dog recognized in the woman's posture something old, something once familiar, something that now carried the scent of distance and longing more than belonging. Ghost did not step forward. He waited, anticipating what humans might do before they decided to do it. James did not move either, but his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly, the kind of reaction Emily had only seen when he faced memories rather than enemies. His gaze remained lowered for a moment, as if gathering resolve or steadying himself. Then he lifted it and met the woman's eyes. The air between them felt colder than the wind outside. Emily's pulse thudded unevenly, her mind racing through fragments she had buried beneath anger. Lullabies sung off-key, hands brushing hair from her forehead, hushed arguments behind closed doors that always ended in apologies she never heard. She remembered the night of the funeral, her mother absent, not just from life, but from every story told afterward. She remembered wanting to ask why her mother hadn't come home that evening, why she never walked back through the door, why her father said the accident in a tone that felt too final to challenge. Yet here she was, alive, breathing, standing in front of Emily in a diner thick with grief and unspoken truths. The woman's voice cut through Emily's racing thoughts. "Emily," she said quietly, not reaching out, not stepping closer. The single word shook every bone in Emily's body. It wasn't the sound of her name that hurt. It was the way it was spoken, with a mixture of hope and remorse, as if the woman feared the name might crumble under the weight of time. Emily swallowed hard. Her voice came out as a whisper, sharper than she intended. "You're supposed to be dead." Conversations in the diner stuttered into silence. The bikers, once amused and restless, now sat frozen, sensing a deeper current than the petty conflict they'd stirred. The grieving newcomer lowered his gaze, bowing his head, as if paying respect to a pain that mirrored his own. Carla took a step back, realizing this was not the kind of situation she could mediate with coffee refills and gentle patience. The woman flinched, a tremor of guilt flickering through her posture, but did not look away. "I know," she replied, voice strained, "and I am sorry." Emily felt anger ignite like a spark on gasoline. "Sorry," she repeated, louder than she meant to. The word escaped her with years of abandonment packed inside. "Do you have any idea what—" Her voice cracked. She bit down on the rest of her sentence, feeling her eyes sting. She refused to cry in front of these strangers, refused to hand her vulnerability back to the woman who left it exposed years ago. James finally spoke, his voice quieter than Emily expected, but steady. "Why now?" His tone carried none of the grief Emily remembered from childhood, none of the rage she imagined he must have buried. It held something closer to resolve, an insistence that every question deserved an answer. The woman inhaled slowly, as if steadying herself before walking across broken glass. "I shouldn't be here," she admitted. "But when I heard about the accident outside town earlier today, I thought maybe it was her." Emily blinked. "Her who?" The woman's eyes softened with a grief Emily didn't recognize. "You," she whispered. That single syllable struck Emily with sudden clarity. Her mother had not returned to reclaim a place, but to confirm that the space still held her daughter's life. Emily's knees weakened, and for a moment she feared they might give out. James's fingers flexed at his side, as if his body prepared to catch her before his mind decided whether to move. Emily steadied herself with a breath that shook so badly she almost collapsed inward. The woman took one slow step forward, stopping when Ghost's gaze sharpened. She didn't attempt to pet him or speak to him. She nodded once, acknowledging his unspoken warning. Ghost lowered his head slightly, not in threat, but in recognition of boundaries. Emily's anger surged again, sharp and brittle. "So you stayed gone for years because... why? You thought we didn't need you?" The woman's reply trembled. "No, I stayed away because I thought you might be better without me." The answer struck Emily with unexpected force. She felt her chest cave inward, breath knocked loose without touch. Her voice wavered but didn't fall apart. "And what did you think when you found out we weren't?" The woman looked at her with eyes full of regret she had no right to expect forgiveness for. "I wished I had come sooner." Emily pressed her palm flat against the table, grounding herself. Everything in her wanted to deny the woman's pain, to dismiss it as cowardice, but somewhere beneath the surface, another emotion simmered, longing so old it felt like a bruise she'd forgotten she carried. The biker nearest them muttered something under his breath, but no one responded. Even he understood this was not a conflict he belonged to. James took a slow breath, gaze shifting between Emily and the woman. The tension in his shoulders told Emily he had prepared himself for a battle with strangers, not this. Emily's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Are you staying this time?" The woman hesitated, the pause almost unbearable. "If you want me to," she answered. Emily's heart twisted. She couldn't say yes, not yet. She couldn't say no, not anymore. Before she could respond, the diner lights flickered, and the humming of the heater faltered for a moment, as if the building itself braced for what came next. Outside, another pair of headlights slowed near the entrance, snow swirling in their beams. Emily looked toward the window, pulse racing, aware that the night was far from finished, and whatever waited outside had the power to redefine everything again. Outside, headlights washed brief bands of white and amber across the diner windows, while snow fell in slow, stubborn sheets, muting the town into a hush that clashed with the noise inside. Inside that fragile bubble of light, Emily stood between the life she had lived and the one she thought she had lost. Her father on one side, the woman who should have been a memory on the other, and behind them the restless presence of the bikers who had never expected the night to turn into someone else's reckoning. Her pulse thudded so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Part of her wanted to walk toward her mother and demand explanations until her throat went raw. Another part wanted to turn and walk past her father, out into the snow, and keep walking until the cold burned every question away. Instead, she stayed rooted where she was, unable to move without feeling she was betraying someone. James felt the same splitting inside his chest. He had walked into the diner prepared to deal with loud men and bad tempers, not with a ghost stepping through the door wearing remorse like an old coat. His eyes stayed fixed on Emily, measuring each tiny shift in her shoulders, each tremor in her jaw, gauging whether she was about to shatter or stand taller. Ghost stood slightly in front of him now, his instincts tugging in two directions at once, toward the heat of Emily's distress and toward the simmering threat still radiating from the biker's corner. Years of learning to move at James's side in dangerous places had taught the dog one thing above all. Danger often struck precisely when people were most distracted by their own pain. The biker closest to Emily, the one who had leaned on her booth earlier, watched the unfolding family tension with a look that mixed boredom and resentment. He had entered the diner expecting to rule the room by volume and posture. Now strangers with quiet voices and heavy history were drawing attention away from him. That kind of man, James. New often turned careless frustration into cruelty. The biker's gaze slid from the woman near the door to Emily's pale face. He smirked, the expression thin and sharp. "Quite a show you folks are putting on," he drawled. "Family reunion special." His voice cut across the room like a dull blade. No one answered. The grieving newcomer bowed his head again. Carla's jaw tightened, and even the other bikers shifted, some uncomfortable, some amused, none willing to tell him to shut up. Emily's fingers curled against the table edge. She felt raw and exposed, as if her skin had been peeled away to reveal every nerve underneath. The last thing she wanted was to be observed like some roadside spectacle. James saw the way her eyes hardened, the way her shoulders squared in defiance, and a familiar ache moved through him. She was more like him than either of them wanted to admit. The woman at the door took a careful step forward, her voice quiet but resolute. "This is not your business," she said to the biker. There was strength there now, a different kind of courage than the one Emily remembered, born not of certainty but of regret carried too long. The biker's eyes narrowed. He turned away from her and leaned closer to Emily instead, crowding the edge of the booth. "What about you, sweetheart?" he said. "You inviting the whole town to watch your drama, or just whoever happens to walk in?" Something in Emily snapped. Not the anger that shouted or threw things, but the anger that rose from a deep place where grief and humiliation had tangled together for years. "At least I'm not using strangers to feel big," she said. Her voice was steady, colder than she intended. "You need an audience to feel like anything at all." The words landed harder than she expected. For a second, the biker's face went blank, then twisted with offended pride. His friends shifted in their seats, reacting to the blow to his ego more than the content of her insult. James's muscles tightened, his body dropping subtly into a readiness he could not entirely suppress. He did not want a fight. He had spent years walking away from unnecessary violence, but there was a line he would not let anyone cross, and it sat right where his daughter was sitting. Ghost shifted his weight forward, reading James's tension as clearly as any verbal cue. Carla took a step from behind the counter, as if she might intervene, then stopped when she saw the biker's hand flex at his side. The woman near the door inhaled sharply, instinctively moving toward Emily before thinking better of it and freezing mid-step. The biker laughed once, a harsh, humorless sound. "Cute," he said. "Real cute." Then, with the casual cruelty of someone used to testing boundaries until they broke, he reached down and grabbed a fistful of Emily's hair. Pain exploded from her scalp, through her skull, shocking a cry out of her before she could bite it back. The sudden pull forced her head back, her sight flooding with tears and bursts of light. For an instant, the diner stopped. All the unresolved questions about mothers and lies and funerals evaporated, burned away by the pure, immediate reality of a hand hurting her. James's vision narrowed, everything in the room collapsing into one sharp image, his daughter's face twisted in pain, her shoulders pinned by the angle of the biker's grip. The careful restraint he had wrapped around himself all night snapped, not into rage, but into a kind of clarity he had only ever known when lives were on the line. He moved. There was no warning, no shouted command. One moment he was standing several feet away. The next he was at Emily's side, his hand locking around the biker's wrist with precise, unyielding force. Ghost lunged forward with him, not to bite, but to position himself between Emily and anyone else who might move, his entire being focused on shielding her. James's voice came out low and controlled, the calm at the center of a storm. "Let go," he said. The biker tried to yank his hand back, but James's grip did not shift. Training and memory guided his movements, turning years of discipline into instinct. He twisted the wrist just enough to send a sharp bolt of pain up the man's arm without breaking anything. The biker cursed, fingers spasming open, releasing Emily's hair. She collapsed forward, hands flying to her head, breath rushing out in a ragged sob she hadn't meant to let anyone hear. James stepped between her and the biker, using his body like a barrier he should have learned to be long ago. The nearest biker surged up from his seat, anger finally spilling over his earlier uncertainty. "Hey," he snarled, taking 2 steps toward James. Ghost responded instantly, body shifting to intercept, a deep growl building in his chest. It was not the wild sound of an untrained animal, but the warning of someone who had stood beside his human in dark places and knew exactly what violence looked like before it landed. James did not want Ghost to fight. He did not want any of this. But he also knew that sometimes the only way to end a threat was to meet it with enough force that it would not rise again soon. The second biker lunged. James pivoted, letting the man's momentum carry him forward while guiding him sideways with a firm shove. The biker stumbled into a chair, losing balance and crashing to the floor in a clatter of metal and curses. Another started to rise, but the sound of someone shouting for the police at the back of the diner cut through the chaos. The grieving newcomer had his phone raised, already speaking rapidly into it, voice shaking as he described what was happening. Carla stood rigid, eyes wide, one hand gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles blanched. The first biker recovered enough to swing at James, but the blow lacked training and intention, powered only by bruised ego and adrenaline. James shifted just enough to avoid the hit, then delivered a quick, controlled strike to the man's midsection, knocking the wind from him without causing permanent harm. The biker doubled over, gasping, rage burning in his eyes but trapped behind his body's failure to obey. Ghost stayed between Emily and the rest of the room, ears tuned to every movement, ready to move wherever James's safety line shifted. The woman who had once been part of this family knelt beside Emily, not quite touching her until she saw her daughter's hand loosen on her own hair. "Are you all right?" she whispered. Emily wanted to pull away, to deny the comfort, but her body shook too badly to pretend she didn't need something to hold on to. She nodded once, then shook her head, then gave up, and let her mother's hand hover near her shoulder. It was not forgiveness, but it was not rejection either. Outside, sirens faint at first grew louder, slicing through the winter air with the promise of authority. Inside, the remaining bikers faltered. Their earlier bravado crumbled as they took in the fallen chairs, the way half the diner now stood witness, with phones recording and eyes wide with outrage. James backed up a step, hands visible, muscles still tense but ready to stand down as soon as he was sure Emily was safe. He did not chase anyone. He did not strike again. His role was not to punish, it was to protect, and he had done what was necessary to end the immediate threat. The sirens cut off abruptly outside, followed by the crunch of tires and the heavy slam of car doors. A moment later, 2 police officers entered, scanning the room with practiced efficiency. One of them, a man with lines of fatigue etched into his posture, announced for everyone to stay where they were. The other moved instinctively toward the groups that looked most likely to reignite trouble. It did not take long to understand what had happened. Witnesses spoke up, some tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as they saw how their words gave shape to the truth. The newcomer pointed to the biker who had grabbed Emily. Carla confirmed what she had seen, voice steadying as she described the harassment and the sudden escalation. Several other diners chimed in, their accounts aligning. No one tried to paint James as the aggressor. They did not need to embellish anything. The reality was clear enough. A man had hurt a girl, and her father had stopped him with more control than most people on the street could have managed. The officer closest to James asked for his version. James answered simply, describing actions, not feelings. He did not mention how his heart had nearly broken hearing his daughter scream. He did not talk about the years of training that had taught him to respond without hesitating. He certainly did not confess that part of him felt he had been trying to make up for a dozen moments when he had not been there. He only said, "He grabbed her. I removed his hand and..." restrained him until he stopped coming forward. The officer watched his face for a long time, then glanced around at the nodding witnesses and the video screens held up by shaking hands. Finally, he exhaled and nodded once. "You did enough," he said quietly. "No more." The bikers were handcuffed one by one, anger curdling into sullen silence as they were led outside to waiting patrol cars. The leader, still wheezing slightly from the blow to his ribs, shot James a final look that was more wounded pride than threat. James held his gaze without triumph, then turned away. He had nothing more to take from this man and nothing to prove to him. Inside, the tension slowly drained like air leaking from a balloon. People righted chairs, sat back down, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. The newcomer sank onto his seat again, grief still heavy, but now cushioned by the knowledge that someone else's cruelty had been stopped. Carla wiped a shaking hand across her eyes, then moved to refill coffee cups no one had asked for, using the familiar motions to steady herself. Emily sat in the booth, fingers still buried in her hair, scalp throbbing, emotions ricocheting wildly. She felt James's presence beside her before she saw him sit down at the edge of the seat, careful not to crowd her. Ghost eased closer, resting his focus fully on her now that the danger had passed, his entire history of loyalty and shared hardship coiling into a single, simple instinct. Stay. "You okay?" James asked softly. She could have answered yes to spare him. She could have answered no and let everything spill out. Instead, she said the only truthful thing that fit between them right now. "I will be," she murmured. He nodded, accepting that as both a promise and a challenge. The woman who had once been his wife, the one Emily had believed dead, stood beside the table, hands clasped together, as if she did not know what to do with them. She watched father and daughter with a look that held pride, pain, and something like envy. James looked up at her, and for a moment Emily sensed old battles and older love passing silently between them. He broke the stare first. "We'll talk," he said to her, voice gentle but firm, "but not here, not tonight." The woman nodded slowly. Her gaze dropped to Emily. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, "for all of it. You don't have to forgive me. Just know leaving you was the worst thing I ever did, and staying gone didn't fix anything." Emily swallowed against the ache in her chest. She wanted to scream that sorry wasn't enough. She wanted to say she had spent years grieving someone who had chosen absence. But she also saw the tremor in the woman's hands, the hollowness in her eyes, the way regret ate at her from the inside. For the first time she understood that she was not the only one hurting. "I'm not ready," Emily said quietly. The woman's shoulders sagged, accepting the sentence like a deserved verdict. Then Emily added, "But I'm not closing the door either." It was a small concession, but it was real, and it was more generous than the woman had expected. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "That's more than I deserve," she said. "Thank you." When the officers finished their reports and assured everyone they were free to go, the night finally began to loosen its grip. The woman stepped toward the door, pausing just long enough to give Emily one last look. "I'll be in town for a while," she said. "If you ever want to talk, Carla knows where I'm staying." Emily nodded once, not committing, not refusing. As the door closed behind her mother, the cold outside pressed against the glass for a moment before receding, leaving the diner warmer than it had felt in hours. James stood slowly. "We should go," he said. For the first time since she had stormed out of the house, Emily did not argue. She slid out of the booth, carefully, wincing when her scalp protested, and followed him toward the door. Ghost padded beside her, shoulder brushing her leg like a promise. Outside, the night was still deep and cold, the snow reflecting the distant glow of streetlights. The patrol cars idled nearby as the last of the bikers were secured and driven away. Emily shivered and pulled her jacket tighter. James unlocked the truck and opened the passenger door for her, a small, old-fashioned gesture that caught her off guard. She climbed in without protest. Ghost hopped up after her, settling between them as usual, but somehow his presence felt less like a barrier and more like a bridge. As James started the engine and pulled away from the diner, silence settled over the cab. Not the heavy, resentful silence of earlier, but something more tentative, as if words were lining up quietly, waiting for their turn. The lights of the diner shrank in the side mirror, then vanished behind a curve. The road stretched ahead, a sea, dark ribbon edged in snow. After a long moment, Emily spoke, her voice low. "I'm still angry," she said. "You weren't there when she left. You weren't there when I needed you. That doesn't just disappear because you showed up at a diner." James gripped the wheel a little tighter, but his reply was steady. "I know," he said. "I can't change what I missed. I can only decide what I do now." She watched his profile, the way his jaw clenched around the truth, the way his eyes stayed on the road not to avoid her, but because he had spent his life learning to keep moving even when everything inside him wanted to freeze. "You came tonight," she admitted. "You did not have to." He drew a slow breath. "I did," he answered, "because I'm your father. That doesn't stop being true just because I failed at it before." Ghost shifted, resting his attention on both of them, sensing the subtle easing of distance, feeling the tension begin to bleed out, like warmth from a long-closed room. Emily stared out at the snow for a while, watching the flakes streak past the window like brief, bright lives. Finally, she said, "I don't know how to forgive you yet." James nodded once, eyes still forward. "You don't have to," he said. "Not on my timeline. Just let me try to be here while you figure it out." The simplicity of the answer struck her more deeply than any elaborate apology could have. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached down and placed her hand lightly on Ghost's back, feeling the steady, grounding presence of a companion who had followed her father through thunder and darkness, and chosen, without question, to follow her too. The truck rolled on through the quiet Spokane night. The house they were returning to would still be small and worn, the rooms still haunted by memories and empty chairs and old photographs. There would be more arguments and painful conversations and days when neither of them knew what to say. But as the tires hummed against the road and the beam of the headlights carved a clear path through the snow, Emily realized something had shifted. She was no longer running away alone. She was going home with someone who had finally decided to walk beside her instead of behind or ahead. For the first time in a long time, the ordinary road in front of them did not feel like an escape or a sentence. It felt like a beginning that they would have to earn one step at a time, together, with Ghost's unwavering loyalty pacing their progress like a silent, steady heartbeat. When the road finally quiets and the snow settles on every rooftop and streetlight, the story leaves behind more than bruises and broken chairs. It leaves a reminder that sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with trumpets or flashes of light. They arrive in the form of second chances. A father who shows up when it matters most. A daughter who decides not to close her heart forever. A bond that begins to heal not through perfect words, but through presence, forgiveness, slowly unfolding, and love that refuses to disappear even after years of silence. And maybe, just maybe, that is how God works most often in our lives. Not always through parting seas or thunder in the sky, but through the quiet strength to endure another day, through the courage to say, "I'm still angry, but I'm willing to try," and through the unseen hand that nudges us back toward the people we are meant to walk beside. Every family has its storms, every heart its scars, yet grace does not fail those who keep searching for home. So if tonight you lift your eyes to the cold winter sky and exhale a tired breath, may you remember, miracles often begin in the moment we refuse to give up on each other. and the Lord hears even the quietest prayer whispered through tears. If this story touched your heart even a little, I invite you to do 3 simple things. Share it so someone who needs hope can feel less alone. Comment your thoughts. Your words may strengthen someone else. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story of loyalty, redemption, and courage. May God bless and protect you and your family in every journey ahead, and may He grant you the strength to hold on, the grace to forgive, and the miracle of finding your way home.